It is my great pleasure to introduce today Professor Benedito Machava, a fellow Mozambican, as I said, conterrâneo. I guess I can appropriate that identity, right? Benedito Machava is a historian of colonial and post-colonial Africa. He was raised and educated in Mozambique, received his BA in history and archaeology from the University Eduardo Mondlane, where he lectured in history from 2008 to 2012. One of the things we found out is that I was there at Mondlane. We never connected somehow. He earned both his MA and Ph.D. From the University of Michigan in 2014 and 18, respectively. Between 2018 and 2020, Dr. Machava was a Cotsen-Link Postdoctoral Fellow in the Society of Fellows at Princeton University, and since 2020 he has held a position as assistant professor in the Department of History at Yale University. His research, which has been supported by fellowships from the Social Sciences Research Council, the Guggenheim Foundation, among other institutions, focuses on liberation struggles, decolonization, nation building, socialism, and socialist experiments in Africa. His articles have appeared in such prominent journals in the field of African history as Africa, the Journal of African History, and the Journal of Southern African Studies. His current book, Manuscript, which I understand is completed, is entitled The Morality of Revolution, Reeducation Camps, and the Carceral Regime in Socialist Mozambique, 1974 to 1990. And this book examines the politics of public morality, carcerality, punishment, and citizenship in post-independence Mozambique. The topic of his lecture is different from the book. It's possibly his second book project, and that's, as I mentioned, The Life I Lived, which has now become history, which is great because it makes me feel really young. My life is now history. The Morality of Revolution, Reeducation Camps, actually.
It's actually the road not taken, the colonization and political imagination in Mozambique.
Oh, so the title's changed slightly. It's not the same title that appears on the website, and he's going to talk about a sort of settler-based movement that took place right after the Portuguese Revolution. You'll explain it all, but it's a really interesting period, as I said, which I know I'm somewhat familiar with. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Benedito Machava.
Thank you so much, Professor Madureira, for the very kind introduction, and more importantly for the invitation to come to this very prestigious historical gathering to share my work. I'm very honored, and I also want to thank Unifier and Ahmed Abdullahi for putting the often complicated strings to bring me here. They're very accommodating, very patient, I would say. And thank you all for coming at what is, I'm sure, a very busy time of the semester. So what I'm sharing is the initial work of what I've been doing for my second book project, and most of it, as you'll gather, is quite tentative still. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts, as they will surely help me think through the questions that I'm exploring and the story that I want to tell in this book. So on April 25th, 1974, a coup d'etat in Lisbon overthrew the Portuguese fascist regime, leading to the sudden end of Portuguese colonial rule in Africa. More than a decade of armed struggle in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique had exhausted the resolve of the Portuguese army, particularly its junior officer corps. So eager to rid their nation of the overdue colonial burden, the coup plotters compelled the new Portuguese government to initiate negotiations for decolonization and transfer of power. So in Guinea-Bissau, the Portuguese had little to negotiate because the war was already won by PAGC, and Guinea-Bissau declared independence, in fact, in 1973. And in Angola, three nationalist movements contended for supremacy, and Portugal's attempt to sort of bridge their differences failed, leading to civil war even before decolonization. Now in Mozambique, the outcome of the coup favored the Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo, and interestingly enough, some of the leading coup plotters and high-ranking members of the new Portuguese government had been born and raised in the settler colony of Mozambique. So after quick and quite amiable negotiations in the Zambian capital of Lusaka on September 7, 1974, the Portuguese conceded to Frelimo's terms and recognized the liberation movement as the only legitimate representative of the people of Mozambique. And 2 weeks later, a Frelimo-dominated transitional government took power. And with listless, sometimes sporadic cooperation of the Portuguese authorities, the new rulers outlined essentially the road to be traveled from then on. Through incandescent public statement, printed edicts, and all kinds of radical commandments, the new rulers instituted a highly centralized one-party system, a state-led command economy, and of course no civil liberties. And so Mozambique went from one repressive regime to another. Now, the historiography of Mozambique has sort of gravitated around the roads taken before and after decolonization. So the oppressive nature of colonial rule is well documented. The challenges of post-coloniality have also been quite mapped. And in fact, John Saul's aptly titled book, A Difficult Road, captured well the roadblocks that shaped Mozambique's transition from colony to sovereign nation. Yet, like most scholars of his generation, who still sort of believed in the liberating power of African socialism, Saul was somewhat blind to the repressive nature of the post-colonial state. So when mentioned the violence that the ruling elites inflicted on the population they liberated from colonialism was often cast as a policy mistake, one among many stumbles in the road to build a just society. So in my first book, that Professor Madureira mentioned, The Morality of Revolution, I kind of addressed this oversight by showing that the post-colonial state reproduced the same repressive mechanisms of colonial rule, even if the discursive archetypes of their governmentality were rooted in the liberating flourishes of socialism. Now, in The Road Not Taken, I take one step back to tell a different story, one that is about possibilities, about dreams dreamed but not realized. Because in the 6 months between the fall of the Portuguese colonial regime and Frelimo's takeover, multiple political avenues seemed open. More than 20 political parties emerged in the capital seat of Lourenço Marques and the second seat of Beira. And this was unprecedented in the history of Portuguese Africa, because unlike British and French colonial rule, Portuguese colonialism gave no space for African political formations. And Portugal's unwillingness to decolonize and the regime's tight policing of the public sphere led nationalist movements to consolidate in exile. So, like their counterparts in Angola and Guinea-Bissau, Frelimo was founded in Tanzania, not as a political party, but a coalition front of various exiled political activists who shared one goal, and that was the liberation of Mozambique from colonial rule. So 10 years of armed struggle crystallized Frelimo's vision for Mozambique, a vision that in many ways triumphed by suppressing other alternatives. But the political parties that emerged in the capital soon after the coup represented for the first time the multiple possible routes that Mozambique could take after decolonization. And these parties represented, in my understanding, the genuine work of political imagination by those who witnessed the end of colonial rule. So their political aspirations were ignored in the Lusaka Agreement that established Frelimo as the only legitimate political force in Mozambique. Generally, we are told that democracy in Africa came through the demands of international financial institutions, keen on shifting the continent from state-led developmentalism to neoliberalism in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And of course, in Mozambique, the proof is the opening of the political sphere as part of these sort of structured adjustment programs, which led to the emergence of multiple parties in 1990. But in The Road Not Taken, I demonstrate that there was a moment in which the political sphere was wide open in Mozambique. One led not by external demands, but by genuine endogenous political thinking. Because with this prospect of decolonization suddenly on sight, both Africans and white settlers wrestled with ideas of democracy and the political futures that could best accommodate the racial, class, and ethno-cultural differences of Mozambique society, and dealt with the legacy of colonialism. Short-lived and experimental as this moment was, it remains to me the most democratic and politically dynamic in the history of Mozambique. Of course, that's not to say that it was peaceful, quite the opposite, quite violent. But it reflected the passions of those who argued and debated about what decolonization could be and what independence should mean. And for many, independence meant political pluralism, multiracial sociability, freedom of association, freedom of speech and mobility, etc., etc. Yet for others, independence also meant the chance to reconfigure the relationship with Portugal by simply becoming autonomous within the structures of governance of the former colonial power. In a kind of transnational commonwealth similar to that proposed by Francophone African elites in the 1950s. And even those who really endorsed Frelimo as the only legitimate political force capable of ruling Mozambique still imagined a more plural society that preserved some of the political, economic, and symbolic relations with Portugal. Now, none of these possible roads were taken, yet they cast a long shadow over the path that Mozambique took after decolonization, because as Frelimo shut down alternative political alignments in favor of this one sort of top-down project of nation building, the political fervency that captured the imaginaries of those who dreamed a different Mozambique for 6 months essentially appended the new regime, because opposition to Frelimo rose not only from external forces seeking to undermine the socialist experiment, as previous scholarship suggested, but from people's realization that independence betrayed the country imagined at the dawn of colonial rule. Now, it is often a difficult task, and I recognize this, to capture what people imagine to be possible in the dying days of colonial rule in Africa, sort of their anxieties and hopes for better futures, precisely because we know what came next, right? We know what came with independence. That is the triumph of the territorial nation sovereignty and its socio-political ills. As Frederick Cooper noted several decades ago, the difficulties compounded by the tendency that was predominant in the time of his writing, but still present today, to see decolonization as a moment of triumph, and the post-colonial reality as a failure. So these sort of binary narratives preclude our ability to see decolonization as a process that opened and foreclosed political possibilities and configurations of power, not from hindsight, but from the vantage point of those who experienced the process. So to grasp this sense of process, as Cooper would have it, historians of African decolonization must ask how wide were those possibilities, and how much did actions taken at one of the many conjunctures narrow trajectories and alternatives. And Cooper insisted that in thinking about such questions, we can never distance ourselves entirely from our present, but we can imperfectly look at different people in their different present, imagining their futures. So a number of scholars have taken the lead from Cooper and have sort of shed light on the wide net of political possibilities that the downing of colonial imperialism engendered in colonial dominions in Africa and across the world. So working within and across territorial boundaries, scholars have shown the diverse array of political imaginaries that decolonization opened and foreclosed, from transcontinental federalism to Pan-African solidarities, cosmopolitan unionism to labor activism, to socialist internationalism and Cold War non-alignment, etc., etc. Now, whether these imaginings and possibilities were realized or not is not really the point. As Gary Wilder points out, these possible decolonial futures were an integral part of an epochal process of global restructuring that unfolded on a vast political terrain inhabited by diverse actors and agencies that warrant historical examination. So I'm taking the cue from this really insightful new scholarship on decolonization to capture the moment of Mozambique's decolonization through the lived experience of those who saw the window of opportunities open and close in the course of 6 months. But unlike most of the new scholarship on decolonization, my focus tend to focus more on the intellectual histories of this process. Mine is more a work of social history of decolonization. And although the key moment of my study is the 6 months between the fall of colonial rule and Frelimu's takeover in 1974, my chronology stretches further back to the early 1960s. Because if the tumultuous 6 months of transition put those possibilities within reach, the political imaginaries that produced them evolved in the late period of Portuguese colonial rule. And this was a period in which Portugal was reforming, essentially, its colonial policy in response to the armed insurgency in Africa. And although the regime maintained its tight grip on the political sphere, crushing any form of anti-colonial activism, in Mozambique in particular, the economic reforms opened up a space, a few channels for social mobility of a small but growing African middle class. So unwittingly, the Portuguese reforms of the 1950s and 60s, which comparatively came late, if they were to be compared with their counterparts, the French and the British, 2 or 3 decades earlier. They engendered closer links. These reforms engendered closer links between the small section of progressive settlers and the rising African middle class, particularly in the capital city of Lourenço Marques, present-day Maputo. So if educated Africans sought to expand the networks of European patronage that were indispensable for social mobility in a very racially policed society like colonial Mozambique, in building relations with Africans, progressive settlers sought kind of a validation to their ambiguous anti-colonial sentiments. Because the increased nervousness of the regime, as my colleague Marisa Moorman, your colleague here, would have it, and its repressive politics brought these two groups into political collaboration. While deeply attached to Portugal, progressive settlers hated, essentially, the fascist regime and the lack of civil liberties. So their aspirations were somewhat aligned with the colonial business class who, like their counterparts in South Africa or Rhodesia, were somewhat distrusted the metropolitan power and wanted more political autonomy for the colony. So they comprised the most educated white-collar segment of colonial society, namely lawyers, medical doctors, writers, and artists of all sorts. And despite the insidious presence of the state police, they took advantage of the regime's ambivalence towards settler opposition in the colonies, because while the fascist regime could repress its citizens in the metropole essentially unhindered, in the colonies the equation was different, because repressing whites in the colonies undermined all the ideological principles that sustained Portuguese colonialism. So it was more important for the regime to preserve the impression of a united, unified European community and their sort of civilizational superiority before the natives than repressing white descent. So, aware of this, of the regime's hesitancy in handling their dissenting politics in Africa, progressive settlers had far more space of maneuver than their metropolitan counterparts. So it's not surprising that the machinations that led to the overthrow of the regime in 1974 began in the colonies and were largely carried out by people from the colonies. So association with Africans, timid and quite limited though it was an act of dissent, right? It not only undermined the racial barriers that the Portuguese regime sought to keep intact in the colonies, it also gave progressive settlers a more sympathetic attachment to Africa. So soon after the coup, they kind of coalesced around a timid political organization which called themselves Democratas de Moçambique, or Democrats of Mozambique. I say timid because they never really assumed themselves to be a political party. I will have more to say about this in a bit. On their part, the African urban intelligentsia widened the scale of its nationalism by coming into closer contact with progressive settlers. because as Frelimo's struggle advanced in the far north, the state police installed a near state of siege in the African quarters in the south, arresting Frelimo sympathizers and collaborators, and just about anyone suspected of anti-colonial sentiments. So back in 1964, when Frelimo launched its armed struggle, a small group of guerrilla operatives led by Matthias Mbowa, we'll come back to this name later on, went all the way from Tanzania to the capital in Lorenzo Marques to plant the seeds of insurgency that is at the heart of the colonial administration. And this was to be Frelimo's fourth military region of operation after the three regions that were in action in the north. And it was a disastrous miscalculation in that just about a few months after the insurgents arrived in the capital and sort of began mobilizing militants, the Portuguese secret police uncovered the underground networks and arrested hundreds of would-be insurgents. And such was the efficiency of its networks of informants in the African quarters, but also within Frelimo. And of course, the Portuguese regime held this operation a huge victory, and in well-publicized trials, condemned the defendant to long-term imprisonment. But this was an opportunity for progressive settlers, because the Democrats of Mozambique put in an impressive team of attorneys in defense of the nationalist activists. Of course, they failed because everyone was put in jail, but their act of defiance against the colonial regime struck an important chord among Africans who came to see them as political allies. So in the years after the trial, from 1966 until the collapse of the colonial regime in 1974, both Frelimo in Tanzania and the remaining underground activists in southern Mozambique essentially lost contact with each other, as Frelimo focused on the northern frontier, and leaders of the failed fourth military region languished in jail. So this gulf of almost 8 years had significant consequences in the development of political thinking in Mozambique. Because while Frelimo underwent a revolutionary transformation from a purely anti-colonial movement into a socialist, Maoist-oriented vanguard party, political activism in the South moved in a completely different direction, in alliance with the moderate politics of progressive settlers under the umbrella of this movement, the Democrats. And I'm using moderate and progressive sort of interchangeably because it is still difficult for me to disentangle the two given the ambivalent position that I will try to illustrate later on. So if the two sides, Frelimo and the revolutionaries in the South, retained the idea that they were on the same side of the trenches, their visions for the future of Mozambique grew diametrically opposed. These were essentially two different political groups that still liked to think that they were in the same trenches of the struggle. Because Frelimo started their struggle in the early 1960s with the simple goal of, as I said, pressuring the Portuguese to consider dialogue towards majority rule, but by the 1970s, their goals went beyond regime change and really aimed at the profound transformation of Mozambican society along the lines of Afro-Marxism. And so they combined political vanguardism with the responsibilities of a proto-state in anticipation for when they would be in power. And this change, this transformation, was totally lost to the southern activists who expected Frelimo to be in power, but within the democratic structures that included progressive settlers and preserved the symbolic economic and administrative ties with Portugal. So arising out of the long years of collaboration between progressive settlers and African activists, this political possibility had started to infiltrate the junior ranks of the Portuguese army in Mozambique and in the colonies in general, where dissatisfaction with the colonial war that seemed to have no end on sight loomed. So the plotters who brought the Portuguese regime down in April 1974 were partly also animated by this possibility. And they put it on the agenda as they formulated the political body in Lisbon to oversee the transition to a new government. And this body was the Junta de Salvação Nacional, or National Salvation Board. I will not relate the story of of the coup here. We don't have time, but suffice to say is that after overthrowing the fascist regime without shedding blood, the junior officers did not take power directly. They entrusted the GSN to negotiate the ceasefire with African nationalist movements and initiate the process of decolonization. And the head of the board was General Antonio Spinola, one of the 3 top officers in the army, and formerly in charge of the war effort in Guinea-Bissau. So a few months before the coup, Spinola published a very incendiary book entitled Portugal in the Future, which propelled him from being one of the peers of the regime into its most outspoken critic. And some scholars argue that this book was the last nail in the coffin of the regime, but I think it's more complicated than that. Because having led the war effort in Guinea-Bissau, which was the most difficult war front for the Portuguese, not only because of the brilliance of Amilcar Cabral, but also because of the geography and the terrain, the marshy terrain of Guinea-Bissau. Spinola, more than any other, captured the dissatisfaction about the war among his embattled junior officers, who were already plotting against the regime. And as I already mentioned, some of these officers were first and second generation settlers in Angola and Mozambique, like Hotel Saraiva de Carvalho, who was the chief strategist behind the coup, who shared the mindset of progressive settlers about the future of the colonies. So essentially, Spinola put these ideas in his book, and he outlined a 2-stage proposal for the future of the colonies, namely a first stage of progressive autonomy, not full independence, that could last between 10 to 20 years, after which the colonies would have gained political maturity enough to hold elections to be contested by all political parties, which would be the second phase. So essentially, Portugal was late by half a century, right? For this is the same strategy of the French and the British, right, after the Second World War. Yet, in the 6 months that followed the fall of the regime, the GSN proposal would animate the political debates about the road to be taken in the colonies. In my research thus far, I have counted 20 political parties and organizations that sprouted almost overnight after the coup in Mozambique. And we should have a little bit of perspective here, because the country had lived for nearly 70 years under a fascist regime with no space for civil liberties that other colonies, including apartheid South Africa, enjoyed. So the last free African newspaper had been printed in 1929, right? And suddenly people could assemble and talk politics, right? The secret police abandoned the scene, and with it went the censorship of the press, and the sense of public relief and excitement really is easily gained from the volume of publications between April and September 1974. And for the first time, news was no longer confined to a city or a small district, and everyone seemed to have an opinion to share about the future of the country. So the once dormant and largely pro-regime press became the most important site of political argument and legitimation. So in newspapers, in radio stations, parties and all sorts of political organizations announced their existence, disclosed their political programs, mobilized political militants, potential militants and sympathizers, and called for rallies and demonstrations. Of course, some of these parties had but a handful of members, barely enough to put a quorum. Others had so many members that they did not really work, and soon they collapsed or split. And I don't want, of course, to idealize or romanticize this period, but I cannot but appreciate the vibrancy of those 6 months of absolute freedom and hope for a better future. Again, it took another 25 years of a dictatorship and civil war for people in Mozambique to feel the sweet taste of freedom again. So I have categorized these various political formations that argue over the meaning and shape of the conversation in those 6 months in 3 rough groups. And this is all tentative, right? Namely, independent, pro-Frelimo, and anti-Frelimo. Of course, this categorization is not based on ideology. These parties and organizations included members of all sorts of ideological persuasions. There were communists, socialists, anarchists, utilitarian centrists, conservatives, all kinds of political alignment. My categorization is based on the two main questions that was on the table for all of them. And the first was, what role should the organization that had been fighting for independence for 10 years play in a post-colonial Mozambique? Incredible as it may sound, this question has never been really raised in academic circles, and it essentially inverts the historical narrative about this period, precisely because this period has always been portrayed from the vantage point of Frelimo. All of these parties were labeled as, puppets of colonialism. They were meant to undermine the legitimacy of Frelimo. And of course, that's not true. The second was how to deal with the racial legacy of Portuguese colonialism and sort of hold the country together without following the path of Rhodesia in South Africa, where independence resulted in white minority rule, or the example of Algeria, where independence came at the cost of open racial violence and the inglorious exit of the Pieds-Noirs. By independent, which is the first group that I want to briefly analyze, I mean those parties that emerged out of the established circles of political activism and were mostly animated by the prospect of elections, essentially, as proposed by the GSN, right? And they addressed the racial question by assembling members from all social groups. And for a colony where a few days earlier such public gatherings were not only a political offense, but a condemned breach of colonial etiquette, the social makeup of these parties was not short of revolutionary. And the most significant of these was the group United Mozambique, Mozambique United Group, and the party's objectives, as you can read, was meant to the attainment of progressive political autonomy within political institutions enforcing the Portuguese space, and the gradualist language of Spinola and the GSN is quite unmistakable. So, like their Francophone African elites 30 years before, essentially the leaders of Gumo simply wanted to build their own huts within their father's compound. And this, they believed, was the only way to preserve the bonds of the various social groups in the country and the material advantages of European connection. And the party was led by two people who not only had profound political difference, but really hated each other. And I'm yet to figure out how on earth they decided to work together in the first place. Because while the lawyer Maxim Dias fashioned the party as a non-militarized version of Frelimo, the high school teacher, Joana Simeão, regarded Frelimo's struggle totally unnecessary. And the only female figure in this story, in fact, the only female politician in the history of Mozambique, as far as I'm concerned. Joana Simeão thought that Frelimo should simply end the war and prepare itself to contend the elections with other political parties in equal footing. And for a short while, Gumo drew large crowds in Lourenço Marques and Beira. My own father told me just the other day that he actually went to some of these rallies because he was curious. He'd never heard of Frelimo, and this is the first party that he heard about. And so the party seemed to be poised to become a serious player in the country's political life. But of course, the difference between the two leaders came to the fore, and they split, each forming our own party. And of course, the pro-Frelimo groups played a role in the downfall of Gumo by essentially deploying provocateurs in their rallies, precisely because they reckoned the growing popularity of this independent party. The main pro-Frelimo groups were the Democrats of Mozambique, of course, and their African allies, who were essentially the former political prisoners, just being released from jail immediately after the coup. And they were joined by high school and university students. Again, these groups were never formed a political party. Partly, I think, because ideologically they were a more heterogeneous batch. For example, the students tended to be divided between orthodox Marxists and Maoists and all kinds of leftist ideologies. Overall, they sought to campaign and mobilize support for Frelimo in light of the GSN proposal to create a kind of a transitional government that would, in the distant future, lead Mozambique to independence if the country so wished. So in this regard, this group is not necessarily different from the independent parties The only difference is that they believed that Frelimo was the only force with the political credentials to carry out the GSN program. Of course, what they did not know is that Frelimo did not subscribe to the GSN proposal, and they would reject it outright right after assuming power. In part because, Frelimo was not widely known in south-central Mozambique, despite the 10 years of armed struggle. And this is thanks to the largely effective Portuguese counterinsurgency that kept the majority of the people ignorant about the war. And among the larger settler community of about 200,000 people, nearly as large as the Rhodesian settlers, Frelimo was but a band of terrorists who carried hit-and-run attacks in the far north, but posed no serious threat to the peace and prosperity of the colony. But the Democrats believed that the biggest and most urgent task was essentially the political education of settlers, whom they considered politically immature and numbed by the long years of fascist oppression and censorship of the press. So their biggest fear was the possibility of a Rhodesia-like unilateral declaration of independence, which was already on the cards among some far-right settlers. So to carry out their agenda, they mounted one of the most effective political coups within a coup. They took control of the press and inundated newspapers with images of Frelimo leaders and obviously vitriolic attacks on other parties, particularly Gumo. I have not established how they managed to pull this out, but by early May, the major newspapers had entirely new editorial boards, and they were all active members of the Democrats. And it's interesting that in those early days, few people knew how figures like Samora Machel or other prominent Frelimo leaders looked like. And the images that they kind of circulate were based largely on descriptions by some of the former political prisoners who had known the men back in the 1960s. So judging from this early attempt to produce this sort of iconography of the party's leadership, the results could not have been more disastrous. As my colleague Drew Thompson argues in his more recently published monograph on the history of photography in Mozambique, visual representation was a key instrument in Frelimo's political work, and they quickly realized that their allies were doing a terrible job in Lawrence Meskin Barron. So they sent packages of their illustrated bulletins and photographs from Tanzania. But this visual misrepresentation by the Democrats and their African allies in those early days might seem sort of insignificant, but it reflects a much larger issue that remained dormant until Frelimo came to power, and that is that the political aspirations of the pro-Frelimo groups were not aligned with Frelimo's. And from our cover research and interviews with former members of these groups, I'm convinced that they simply did not really know what Frelimo stood for at the time. The pamphlets and propaganda materials that they received from Frelimo provided little clue into the party's revolutionary ideology. So from what they read, Frelimo's struggle was against the fascist colonial regime, not against the Portuguese. Good. The society Frelimo wanted to build would eliminate racism and socioeconomic asymmetries. Wonderful. And they talked about the emancipation of women, the end of the exploitation of men by men, civil freedoms, equal justice, etc., etc. So these were progressive ideas with which Democrats and their African allies had always stood for. But it was not clear how these ideas would look in a socialist regime. What would emancipation mean? What would freedom mean under socialism? I'm not suggesting that Frelimo deceived them. That's not what I'm trying to say. And I have not consulted Frelimo's own archives, which unfortunately are still closed, to see how the party was thinking as the Democrats were working hard, in fact, on their behalf. But in official historiography, the work of the Democrats has received little consideration. But without their work, Frelimo would not have gained the popularity that the party enjoyed in those crucial moments after the fall of the Portuguese. And quickly, the political vision of the pro-Frelimo group was best articulated by Antonio de Almeida Santos and Domingos Arouca in a series of open letters published in the then very progressive magazine Tempo, or Times of Lourenço Marques. And Almeida Santos, who became a prominent figure in post-revolutionary Portugal's political life, argued at the time that the only viable pathway for Mozambique was a multiracial society under a Frelimo-led government. And he was convinced that Frelimo would not only guarantee the civil liberties expected of any democratic system, but would also preserve what he called the ethnic, economic, and managerial equilibriums of the colonial period. That is, the success of the country depended on maintaining ties with Portugal. So he told his fellow white compatriots that they should either accept this formula or take one of the two available options. One, declare UDI or leave the country, both of which, in his opinion, were suicidal. Now, I've mentioned that the Democrats were both progressive and moderate, and I'm not yet sure if these are workable categories, but, and of course, there's more work that I need to do to unpack their political thinking, but they oscillated between limited leftist aspirations, especially in the form of a single-party system under Frelimo, that their support for Frelimo entailed, and a transnational form of democracy that linked the destinies of post-colonial Mozambique and post-fascist Portugal. Because unlike the Francophone African and Antillean elites who campaigned for self-determination without national sovereignty some 40 years before, and argued that such a political dispensation would improve metropolitan and imperial citizens, both at the material and spiritual level, for the Democrats, the decolonization of Mozambique and other Portuguese colonies was the main factor in the liberation of Portugal from fascism. So democracy in this case would not descend from the metropole to the imperial domains, but the way around. So if the colonies liberated Portugal by orchestrating the coup and in that process liberated themselves, a point that Frelimo would take in the discussing table in Lusaka, democracy would also emanate from the colonies. But on a more personal level, of course, this political interdependence between Portugal and her former colonies offered settlers the comforts and security of a transnational citizenship. They could have both, right? Because unlike their minority neighbors in Rhodesia or South Africa, and despite their anti-fascism, the Portuguese settlers never really developed a sense of white nationalism or nativism, right? They remained above all Portuguese in Africa, and what they wanted was to remain Portuguese in an autonomous Mozambique. And this is essentially what Antonio Almeida Santos sought to achieve by proposing an alliance with Frelimo. So significantly enough, in May, he was invited to join the new Portuguese government in Lisbon in the very important position of Minister of Interterritorial Relations, and this was the former Minister of Colonial Affairs, where he had more influence and worked to put his vision for the colonies in action. And as he confessed in his open letter, quote, everything will be done with the visible urgency, but also with the necessary delay. And obviously was a key player in the negotiations that led Portugal to transfer power to Frelimo. But that was as far as influence could go. Of course, he could not control what Frelimo would do with its power. How are we doing on time? I'm nearly there.
In a few minutes more.
Okay, wonderful. So this cartoon by Paulo Forte, which I hope to use as a front cover of the book, is the best illustration of how the Democrats of Mozambique labored to put Frelimo in power. So here's Portugal's new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mário Soares, and Frelimo's President, Samora Machel, taking the first steps in embracing grand style after the Lusaka Agreement, while the Democrats cleared the way, chasing all the other political parties inside Mozambique. And it's interesting that the DMs are not represented on an equal footing with Frelimo. You know, like other parties, they're small, almost insignificant, right? And it is essentially a statement as to how they view their role in the process. The cartoonist himself, Paul Forte, was one of the active members of the Democrats. And of course, the embrace between the two leaders was a triumph of the vision articulated by Almeida Santos. But on the other hand, one cannot fail to see the repressive side of this representation. For as the carpet rolls and opens the road for a new regime, it also crushes the opposition and shuts the door to alternative possibilities. Again, it's challenging for me to do justice to this representation precisely because I know what came next, based on my first book. I mean, the figure being struck by the neck here with a broom is Joana Simeão, right? And as soon as Frelimo assumed power, she was arrested, incarcerated in a Reeducation camp, and then executed for treason. And of particular note are those figures which are represented as the KKK, was sort of trying to stop the process through acts of terrorism. And these are the anti-Frelimo groups in my tentative classification. Because the unilateral handover of power to Frelimo and the sort of dismissal of all political parties emboldened the anti-Frelimo groups, whose political aspiration really did not go beyond preventing the Nationalist Party from taking power. Although a few of these groups included Africans, the majority were comprised of conservative settlers and army veterans who fought against Frelimo in the north. So they denounced the Lusaka Agreement as a betrayal by Portugal and sought to impede Frelimo from entering Mozambique by acts of intimidation and terror. And really some of their names suited their aims. I mean, they were called Dragões da Morte, Dragons of Death, Mozambique Armed Action, etc., etc. For example, in May, they blew up the headquarters of the Pro-Frelimo student organization and the printing presses controlled by the Democrats. It was a new way of silencing political enemies. But as the negotiations between Portugal and Frelimo indicated that the country would inevitably have a majority black government, under Frelimo, these groups went essentially from protest to despair. So on September 7, as the news came that Portugal has settled the matter with Frelimo, they occupied the airport in Lourenço Marques and the main radio station downtown and called on South Africa and Rhodesia to intervene in their favor. And their supporters joined them by the thousands, hoping to see South African troops march towards the capital. Now, the possibility of a South African intervention was real, and some powerful figures within the far right and a few colonial tycoons like Champali Mo, Georges Jardin, were working on this, but they failed to convince the South African bureaucrats who saw no real potential in the insurrection. Again, I've not done any work on the South African archives for this period, but I expect their diplomatic files to be revealing, to say the least. But what is clear from what I've seen is that unlike Angola, where the nationalists, three nationalist movements contended for power, all with relatively a significant African following. In Mozambique, the South Africans calculated that Frelimo commanded a kind of a more unified following. In other words, there were people to work with in Angola, like Unidas Jones Savimbi, and not so much in Mozambique. Hence their decision to actually invade and intervene in Angola and not in Mozambique. Now, some scholars have referred to this insurrection as a coup attempt against Frelimo, but again, this comes from the sort of official narrative of this period. Of course, this was a very disruptive process. It was responsible for the racial violence that took place in the city, but it was less than a coup, because the insurrection was essentially a desperate uncoordinated act by people who saw no place for them in a pro-Frelimo-led Mozambique. It was an act of fear than a political plot by people who came to Africa empty-handed in the 1940s and were now on the verge of losing their material and racial privileges. Not that I have any sympathy for them, obviously not. So as desperate settlers and a coalition of parties gathered at the radio station and called on the Portuguese army to join their ill-defined cause on the other side of the city in the African quarters, thousands of people were celebrating the Lusaka Agreement in mass rallies organized by the Democrats. So upon hearing about the seizure of the radio station and the airport, bands of armed young men with machetes and pangas marched towards downtown. I mean, if they had succeeded, or if they have reached the downtown area, which was filled with angry settlers armed with NATO-made rifles, the violence would have been unspeakable. And it was thanks to these Democrats and their African allies who worked in conjunction with the Portuguese army, the one section of the army that was pro-Frelimo, to prevent the mobs from reaching downtown and prevent further bloodshed. And to finish, the most heartfelt appeal for a politics that could hold the country together, especially when it was clear that Mozambique would not have a peaceful transition and that the multiracial democracy that animated the activism of so many people was now increasingly impossible. So it came from this appeal to sort of try to hold the country together came from Domingos Aroca, a lawyer, a former political prisoner, and one of the main leaders of the Lourenço Marx African Intelligentsia. And his open letter was published on the very day that Frelimo and the Portuguese delegation agreed on the terms of decolonization in Lusaka. Now, Aroca encapsulated all the contradictions of the democratic vision of his pro-Frelimo peers, because he sought to reconcile the one-party system that his support for Frelimo entailed, while hoping that the party would uphold the highest principles the highest democratic principles of tolerance and dialogue. Because in his mind, there were no magical remedies for the ills of the colonial regime and the racial divide that it engendered in Mozambique. Yet he argued they could not be ignored. Frelimo's task was gigantic, because in the beautiful cities and countryside farms, about 200,000 settlers lived in a life of comfort and were in total control of the administrative and economic life of the country. While in the shanty towns and rural areas, about 12 million exploited and disenfranchised Africans lived in poverty. So bridging the gap between the two communities and build a kind of a multiracial society would take big guts, refrained egos, and a sense of brotherhood and forgiveness. Could Frelimo rise to the occasion and take this responsibility to counsel and rule? Could violence be avoided? On the other hand, Aroca embodied the timidity and the self-righteousness of his group, because he proposed a path that could lead the country to a better future while remaining sort of detached from the actual work of bridging the racial and class gap that he reckoned was the biggest task ahead. In fact, many people expected him to occupy a ministerial position in the first Frelimo government. And in fact, for a long time, the Portuguese secret police thought and believed that he would one day become Frelimo's president, given his qualifications and the high esteem with which he was regarded among political activists in Lourenço Marx, especially after the assassination of Eduardo Mondlane, Frelimo's founding president. But when the invitation came to join Frelimo's government in late September, he turned it down. By this time, it was already clear to everyone that the progressive aspirations of the Democrats would be pursued under the ideological mantle of Marxism-Leninism. So Aroca was brave enough to stick to his political principles, but like many of his colleagues, he was forced into exile. And those who stayed had to sort of readjust their political creed to earn the trust of the new regime, while closing their eyes to the persecution of those who continue to call for a multiracial democracy like Joana Simão. So I want to end with this dialogue between Matias Mboa, you remember this, this name, and his colleague, Angelo Xixala. I'll let you read it. But I translated from the memoirs of Matias Mboa, who I had the luck of interviewing. And what is fascinating about him is that he was the closest friend of Samora Machel. And they both fled together. In fact, they plotted to flee from Lourenço Marx in 1963 to join Frelimo in Tanzania. But while Samora was sent to lead the struggle in one of the northern fronts, Mboa was sent to the capital to organize the 4th Military Region, where he was immediately arrested and spent nearly 10 years in prison. But he remained the main leader of the Southern activists, and soon after the April coup, he kind of regrouped his network and coordinated the pro-Frelimo campaigns together with the Democrats. So here he is leading the first delegation of the Democrats that visited Frelimo in Dar es Salaam in May 1974. And he's united, of course, with his old buddy Samora. And the figure in the middle of the photograph is the Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere. So Mboa returned to Lourenço Marx with a mission, and that was to build the first party headquarters in the capital and set the first party cells among the former political prisoners. And this is the context in which this dialogue took place, as Mboa is telling his colleague what he has just learned from his trip. So although he tried to readjust his political creed, his fears were not unjustified, because the Portuguese had incarcerated him from being a revolutionary. His old friend would incarcerate him for not being a revolutionary enough. And his dream was the road not taken. Thank you.
Well, we are right up to 1. I know some of you have other commitments and places to go, but if I think we can maybe 5 minutes of Q&A if. Thank you so much, Ben. This was, I mean, you know, I was in hog heaven, as they say, but that's just me, you know, because as I said, but we'll talk later.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, please, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to bring up at this point. Yeah, Neil. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That was super interesting. I have just a question that actually relates to this dialogue you've given us here at the end. So one of the many things that's interesting about your talk is, in the beginning, I really appreciate the way you frame this within sort of Fred Cooper's work on sort of openings and closures and thinking about why that's the case. And then you do point out that what's kind of interesting about Mozambique, of course, is the chronology is different from the British and the French. And at one point you said something like, oh, they were just 2 decades late, right? They were doing the same thing, they were just 2 decades late. And I'm wondering about those 2 decades, right? And what people in Mozambique were doing in those 2 decades and what they might have learned. Like, why didn't they have the knowledge, seeing what happened in former French colonies and in former British colonies, and of course what's going on in South Africa is a different story, and what became Zimbabwe. But wouldn't that have activated their political imaginations in ways that would not have been thinkable for the sort of their counterparts in Francophone and in British Africa in the 40s and 50s? Like, what was different here given the chronological differences? And getting back to this, only when I went to Tanzania did I realize, this is maybe not the road we want to go down. But couldn't they have seen that earlier, given sort of what happened in the 60s in those other places?
Yeah, thanks. This is a very interesting question. The difference is that Portugal is not just a colonial regime, it's a fascist regime. And the level of censorship is unthinkable for those who work on other colonial spaces. So the channels of communication are very restricted. There's really little useful information trickling to the colonies because the Portuguese control the channels. Of course, there's a lot more information coming from South Africa, but as you point out, it's a different dynamic. One that would actually align with what some settlers would have liked to have in the colonies. So they're learning very little, but they also learn the things that are sort of in the public imagination. Right? They know that the Congo was a mess. They know that Algeria was a mess, and that those things could be avoided. What is interesting is that the regime itself is knowledgeable about what the British and the French did. That's why, in many ways, I mean, Spinola's book is essentially a kind of a copy of the ideas that the French colonial government did in the 60s. In the 50s. So the regime knows, but the public doesn't have a lot of information. And because of the war, there's a state of emergency that is in place in the colonies. And for people like Mo, I mean, he's in jail for 10 years.
Yeah. I would follow up that.
Yeah, Emily.
Any students have questions that want to take further? Thanks so much for that talk. That's so exciting. I'm really excited about the narrative challenge you have of writing about this period of openness and multiple possibilities, you know, knowing what you know about what comes next. I think this is going to be a fantastic project. One of my questions is, you know, of course I'm blown away by this, like, you know, by your count 20 political parties, and thinking about the variety of different kinds of political imaginaries we can see in this really chaotic, interesting moment. And I guess one of my questions is, if you have a sense of just how open that moment of openness was, and this maybe in some ways builds off of Neil's question about knowing, you know, about the different kinds of, you know, 20 years intervening between other moments, because, for example, it seems like, at least from the kind of schema that you drew of independent, pro-Frelimo, anti-Frelimo, there is a certain take-it-for-granted parameters to what the politics were, right? You know, it's about, it assumes the nation state, it assumes the boundaries of Mozambique, it assumes the particular kind of political community that's already kind of spatially determined. And I wonder if there were other kinds of imaginaries in there. I mean, like, if we're talking about the earlier period about, for example, different kinds of images of federation, or by contrast, secessionist movements or any of that, or whether the conversation was very much about, accepted Mozambique as the territory, as the community, or whether there was any of those kinds of other kinds of categorizations.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think these are key things for almost everyone. There is no debate about secessionism. There is no debate about dividing the country. Those borders are accepted by everyone. In fact, they would be guarded by almost everyone. Even though Mozambique had 16 years of civil war immediately after independence, there was never a talk of secession, of occupying a certain section of the country. So that was a given. But transnationalism and federalism was on the card. It was federalism with Portugal. Mm-hmm. And this is perhaps the biggest yearning of the progressive settlers, because of course they want Mozambique to become autonomous, to become sort of independent, but they don't want to lose their attachment to Portugal. That is important, right? And it explains why, when all those possibilities failed, you have a sudden, massive exit of settlers. Of course, it's a more complicated story, but one of the reasons why they leave is because, well, they did not recognize themselves within the structures that triumphed with decolonization. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I know that because we were late, I kind of
I don't know,
went over the board.
There's one burning question, I suppose we can entertain it, but the one thing I was going to say is that I lived about a couple of blocks from where all those people gathered, and I was a kid and I was very curious. Yeah, the rioters and all that. And they stayed for a couple of days.
Yeah.
They wanted to reproduce basically mini Rhodesia, right? That was the goal of all those settlers. They came from different parts, the periphery and all that. There was all kinds of really disturbing stuff. People walking around with shotguns, and I think some of them, the G3, the machine guns that the Portuguese soldiers had. And so they stayed, 4 or 5 days. And I would come and visit. It was like tourism. And then on the day that it ended,
Dangerous tourism.
Right. On the day it ended, like an armed personnel carrier, the Portuguese army just shot. I don't know if they were just, sent a couple of shots over the crowd. That was the end of it. Everybody dispersed, and that's how it ended. So this thing that it had any, any possibility of really becoming a bigger movement. That how it ended was really like nobody stayed to fight. It's just that
because it wasn't planned. There was no real politics.
There was no organization.
It was very spontaneous.
Yeah.
But what you did not see what was going on in the African quarters, because there you're talking about thousands, almost millions of people gathering, ready to crush this opposition.
And they surrounded the city, right? And I think that's just, as you said, that was the incredible restraint, and somebody was behind that because people talk, let's just push them out to the bay, like all the whites and all that stuff.
So Spinola sends one of these military envoys, and he sort of does a round in a helicopter. And when he sees what was going on in the outskirts of the city, that's where the military came to crush this. Because they knew if they did not do that, it would be a bad plan.
Bloodbath.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much.